The oak tree stood at the edge of the Callaway farm like an old sentinel, its bark split and weathered by 2 decades of Texas sun and wind and ice and rain. Clara Owens pressed her palm flat against it and felt the grooves before she saw them. She felt them the way you feel a scar on your own skin, something familiar, something that had always been part of you, something you had stopped noticing until one day you pressed your fingers against it, and it cracked you wide open all over again. She leaned in closer. The afternoon light was going gold and long, and the dust from the road behind her had not yet settled. She had driven the wagon all the way from Abilene. 3 days of cracked lips and sunburned shoulders, and a heart she had been telling herself for 20 years was perfectly fine. Thank you very much. And the very first thing she had done upon arriving at this property she had just inherited from her dead uncle was walk out to the tree line. She had not known why, not consciously, but now she knew. The letters were worn, but they were still there. They had been carved deep by someone who had wanted them to last, someone who had known they might need to last. CO. And beneath those letters in smaller script, barely visible, but absolutely, irrefutably there, carved by a steady hand with a patience that made her chest seize, SM loves you. Do not forget. Clara Owens pressed her forehead against the bark and did not breathe for a very long time. 20 years. She had been 18 years old. He had been 23. She had been terrified and furious and secretly, desperately in love with a drifter who did not belong to any town, and she had made herself believe that he had simply ridden away, that she had not mattered, that the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her had been the warmth of a man who looked at everything that way. But this was not the work of a man who looked at everything that way. This was the work of a man who had known she would come back, who had wanted her to know, even if it took 20 years, even if she came back a widow with a 15-year-old daughter and a spine made of scar tissue and determination, that she had been loved. Her name was Clara Owens, and she had been loved, and she had not known it. And now she was 38 years old and standing in the Texas dust with her hand on a tree and her heart doing something very inconvenient and entirely beyond her control. The horse behind her snorted. Her daughter, Maggie, called out from the wagon seat, asking if she was all right. Clara straightened. She pressed her lips together. She was Clara Owens, and she had survived things that would have laid stronger women flat, and she was going to survive this too. She just was not sure in that particular moment what surviving it looked like. The year was 1889, and the summer had come to Texas like a debt collector, with heat, with insistence, with the particular cruelty of something that was always going to come, sooner or later, no matter how fast you ran. It had been 1869 when Clara had first come to this farm. She had not come by choice. She had been 18 years old, and her parents had sent her to live with her uncle, Chester Callaway, because there had been trouble. The kind of trouble that small towns in that era called trouble with the same tone they called a woman who spoke her mind trouble, or a woman who refused the wrong man trouble. Clara had done all of those things. She had done them with extraordinary commitment, and her parents had been at their wits' end. And Uncle Chester, who was old and kind and had a farm outside of Dry Hollow, Texas, had agreed to take her for a season. That had been the summer she met Silas Mercer. She had been at the general store in Dry Hollow when he came in. She had noticed him not because he was handsome, although he was, but because he was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of men who had nothing to say. He was quiet the way deep water is quiet, like there was something moving underneath. He had been 23 and lean and brown from the sun, and he had a good horse and not much else. He had told the storekeeper he was looking for day work, maybe a few weeks, maybe longer. He had the kind of voice that did not rush itself. He had boots that had seen a long road. Clara had looked at him for exactly 5 seconds before she had decided to dislike him. She had been good at deciding to dislike drifters. She had learned, the hard way, with the specific education of heartbreak, that men who did not belong to any place did not stay. They were like rain, wonderful and necessary and then gone, and the ground always cracked again afterward. But the world had its own plans for Clara Owens. Chester Calloway had hired Silas Mercer the following morning. Clara had come out onto the porch and found Silas already working, had watched him repair the fence along the north pasture with the methodical care of someone who genuinely respected the work. He had not tried to talk to her. He had not looked at her with the particular type of slow appreciation that made her feel like livestock at auction. He had just worked. She had brought him water at noon because her uncle had asked her to and common courtesy required it. "Thank you," Silas had said. That was all. 2 words. She had waited, because men always followed up 2 words with 10 more, usually about themselves or about her, and he had not. He had just nodded and gone back to work, and Clara had stood there for a moment feeling oddly off balance. "You're not curious about me," she had said before she could stop herself. He had looked up. His eyes were the particular shade of brown that looked almost amber in direct sunlight. "I figure you'll tell me what you want me to know," he had said. It was not a line. She could always tell lines. It was a genuine statement of philosophy, offered without self-congratulation, and it had landed in her chest like something thrown from a height. She had gone back inside. She had told herself she was being ridiculous. The weeks had unfolded slowly, the way summer weeks do in Texas, with the particular suspension of time that happens when the heat makes everything languid and unhurried. Silas Mercer proved himself to be the kind of worker who made Chester Calloway's farm run better than it had in years. He was good with the horses. He could read weather. He knew which crops were struggling and why, and he offered his opinions quietly, without the arrogance that Clara had come to associate with competence in men. He was also, she discovered, a reader. She found out because she had come to the barn one evening to check on the mare who was close to foaling, and she had found Silas sitting in the lamplight with a book. It was a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and it was well worn, the spine cracked from multiple readings. "I did not take you for a reading man," she had said. He had held up the book so she could see the title. "I find it keeps me company on the road," he had said. "A good book is the closest thing to a real conversation you can have by yourself." She had sat down on the stall door and stayed for an hour, talking about books, which became talking about ideas, which became talking about the kind of life you wanted, which became the kind of conversation that you only have with someone who is actually listening. She had gone to bed that night feeling warm in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature, and she had stared at the ceiling and told herself, firmly, that she needed to be very careful. She had not been careful. She had been precisely as incautious as the human heart always is when it is under the influence of something genuine. By the middle of August, they had fallen into a rhythm. Morning work, noon conversations, evenings on the porch when the light softened and the crickets started up, and the world got small and specific and close. Silas talked about the places he had been, California and New Mexico and Kansas, and further north, territories that Clara had never seen. But he talked about them without the restlessness that usually accompanied such accounts. He talked about them the way you describe things you have passed through and left behind. "You miss it?" she asked him once. Moving around like that, he had been quiet for a moment. He was good at honest quiet, at pausing long enough to actually think about what he wanted to say. "I used to think that's just who I was," he had said finally. "A drifter. like it was something fixed in me. He had looked out at the darkening field. I'm not as sure about that as I used to be. She had not let herself think too hard about what that might mean. She had not let herself hope. But she had felt the hope there, small and persistent, like a seed in dry ground. The first time he touched her hand had been an accident, reaching for the same hammer on the workbench in the barn, their fingers overlapping, the contact brief and electric and entirely innocent. She had not pulled away. Neither had he. They had looked at each other in the lamplight with all the careful restraint of two people who were very aware of what they were standing at the edge of. "Clara," he had said, and it was only her name, but the way he said it, like it was something he had been carrying carefully for a long time, made her feel as though she had never actually heard her own name before. "Don't," she had said. Not because she did not want him to say it, but because she was terrified. "Don't what?" he had asked. "Don't make me," she had stopped. She had looked down at their hands, still barely touching. "I know you're going to leave," she had said. "Men like you always leave. It's not a criticism. It's just true. And I can't. I'm not built for losing people, Silas. I'm not made for that. I've been lost enough already." He had looked at her for a long time. His expression was something she could not entirely read. She had been good at reading people, and he had always been the exception to that, the one thing in her world that remained genuinely uncertain. "I hear you," he had said, finally. And he had stepped back and he had let her go, and she had been relieved and devastated in equal measure. And she had told herself that was the right thing, that was the sensible thing, that was the only thing. 3 days later, her parents had sent word. Her mother was unwell. She needed to come home to Galveston. Immediately, she had packed in an hour. Chester had hitched the wagon. She had stood at the edge of the farm, about to climb up onto the seat, and Silas had come across the yard. And she had looked at him, and there had been something in his face that she had never seen there before. Something open and desperate and entirely unguarded. "I want you to stay," he had said. "I can't," she had said. "I know." He had stood very still. He was not a man who made dramatic gestures. "I just needed you to know that." She had climbed up onto the wagon. She had looked back once at the tree line at the farm, at him standing in the yard with the morning sun behind him. She had turned back to the road, and she had not let herself cry until Dry Hollow was 3 miles behind her. She had told herself she would write. She had not written. She had told herself he would write, and the absence of any letter had confirmed what she had always known. That she was right about drifters, that she had been right to leave, that the warmth in his eyes had been exactly what she had thought it was from the beginning, which was nothing that could hold. She had married Thomas Owens in 1872 when she was 21. He had been a good man, steady and kind, a cotton merchant from Galveston, and she had genuinely cared for him. They had had a daughter, Margaret, who everyone called Maggie, born in 1874. Thomas had died in 1885 of a fever, leaving Clara a widow at 34 with a 10-year-old daughter and a modest house and a life that was, by all external measures, settled and proper and fine. And then, in the spring of 1889, word had come from a lawyer in Abilene that Chester Calloway had died and left his farm to Clara, his only remaining family with the inclination or capacity to do something with it. Clara had thought, for 3 weeks, about selling the farm site unseen. She had told herself that was the rational thing to do. She was a practical woman. She had no need to return to a place she had not been in 20 years simply because an old man with a kind heart had left her a piece of land. But there was something she had never been able to entirely put to rest. A wondering, a small, persistent, absolutely irrational piece of her that had never been quite satisfied with the way that summer had ended. She had packed up herself and Maggie and made the journey to Dry Hollow. And now she was standing at the oak tree with her hand on carved letters, and a heart that was behaving very badly. She turned back to the wagon with what she hoped was a composed expression. Maggie was watching her with the particular sharp attention of a 15-year-old who missed nothing and commented on everything. "What was that?" Maggie asked, nodding toward the tree. "Old carving," Clara said. "Who carved it?" "Someone who was here a long time ago." Clara climbed up onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins. "Before you start asking more questions, let's get the wagon unloaded and see what state the house is in." Maggie, who was clever enough to know when to push and when to wait, let it go. For the moment. The farmhouse was dusty and dim and thoroughly uninhabited but structurally sound. Chester had been meticulous about the bones of things, if not always about the surfaces. The floors were good hardwood. The windows were intact. The stove in the kitchen was a solid iron model that Clara recognized as the one that had always been there, and it made her chest do something strange to see it. She and Maggie spent the first evening airing out rooms and making up beds from linens they had brought in the wagon, and eating cold provisions they had packed. Maggie fell asleep quickly. She was 15 and had her father's talent for sleep, a gift Clara had always envied, and Clara sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight with a cup of water and the particular quiet of a woman alone with a significant thought. She was not going to do anything about it. She was 38 years old and she was a widow, and Silas Mercer had not written a letter in 20 years, which meant one of two things. Either he had forgotten her, in which case the carving on the tree was a relic of something brief and long past, and she should treat it as such, or he was dead, in which case the same applied. She was not going to do anything about it. She went to bed with this resolution firmly in place. She woke up the next morning with it somewhat less firmly in place, because she had dreamed about amber eyes and a voice that did not rush itself. And the morning had a particular quality of light that she associated specifically and irrationally with that summer. She made breakfast. She explored the farm. She made a list of what needed repairing and what needed replacing. She was thorough and practical and entirely focused on the task at hand. At noon, she went to Dry Hollow to speak to the lawyer who had handled Chester's estate and to buy supplies at the general store. Dry Hollow had changed. It had grown. There were newer buildings along the main street. A proper hotel had replaced the old boarding house, and the railroad that had been talked about for years had clearly arrived, because there was a station at the east end of town. But the general store was in the same location, and the church at the top of the hill was the same white-painted building it had always been. And the oak that stood in the town square was a little larger but unmistakably the same tree. She did her business with the lawyer, a young man named Greer who had handled Chester's affairs for the last 5 years, and who was respectful and efficient, and who told her the farm was worth a solid sum if she chose to sell, or was a workable operation if she chose to stay. She had not decided which she was going to do. She went to the general store with her list. The proprietor was a woman now, which was different. A solid-looking woman in her 50s named Edna Hollies, who ran the place with the calm authority of someone who had been doing it long enough to consider herself the last word on the subject. Clara was in the middle of arranging for a barrel of flour and a supply of lamp oil when Edna Hollies said, in the tone of someone making idle conversation, "You're the Calloway niece, aren't you? Come to deal with the old man's farm." "I am," Clara said. "Good farm," Edna said. Chester kept it decent. Had a man helping him these last few years who kept it really decent, actually. Good worker, quiet fellow. Something happened in Clara's chest that she chose to ignore. "What man?" she asked, with what she hoped was only polite curiosity. Edna Hollies looked at her with the mild inquisitiveness of someone who has lived in a small town long enough to notice things. "Silas Mercer," she said. "You wouldn't know him. He wasn't here in the old days. He came back, oh, maybe 2 years ago, 3, something like that." Chester was getting on and needed the help. The store was very quiet for a moment, or perhaps it was loud and the quiet was inside. "Clara came back," she said. "He was here years ago, apparently. Before my time here, I came to Dry Hollow in '78. Edna reached for the ledger. "Nice enough man." Chester talked about him like he was family. He was helping out right up until Chester passed. "You know where he is now?" Clara asked. She could hear her own voice very precisely. It was entirely steady. She was proud of it. "Stays at the Morton boarding house mostly when he's in town," Edna said. "Though he's out at various farms around the county more often than not, works hard, doesn't cause trouble." She looked up from the ledger. "You all right, dear? You've gone a little pale." "I'm perfectly fine," Clara said. "The heat." She finished her shopping. She loaded her wagon. She sat on the wagon seat for what was probably too long a time before she finally picked up the reins. He was here. Silas Mercer was here. Not some ghost of a man who had ridden away and been absorbed by the vast American distance. Not a memory and a carving on a tree, but a living man who was in this town and who had, apparently, come back. Who had come back. She did not go to the Morton boarding house. She drove back to the farm. She was a 38-year-old woman with responsibilities and common sense and a daughter to think about. And she was not going to go chasing after a man she had not spoken to in 20 years based on some letters carved into a tree. She was absolutely not going to do that. She lasted 4 days. 4 days of working the farm and making lists and cooking for herself and Maggie, and lying awake listening to the night sounds of a Texas summer, and turning the same thought over and over like a stone in her hand, wearing it smooth. He had come back. He had gone away and then he had come back to this specific place. He had helped Chester. He had been here, walking on this land, breathing this air, and he had gone to that oak tree and carved her name into it. She was certain it had been him. There was no one else who would have done it. There was no one else whose initials were SM, and who had been connected to this farm in that specific and particular way. He had left her a message in the most patient, permanent form available to him. He had carved it into a tree and trusted the tree to hold it. On the 4th evening, Maggie sat across from her at the dinner table and said, without preamble, "Are you going to tell me who carved those initials in the tree, or am I going to have to figure it out myself?" Clara set down her fork. She looked at her daughter, clever, sharp, brown-haired Maggie, who had her father's steadiness and her mother's perception in roughly equal measure. "Why are you so interested?" Clara asked. "Because you've been somewhere else in your head since the moment we arrived," Maggie said. "And I'm 15, not 5. I notice things." She folded her hands on the table with the particular composure of a person making a point. "Also because the initials are CO and SM and you are CO." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "His name is Silas Mercer. He worked for your great-uncle the summer I was 18. I was here for a few months." Maggie waited. "He was a drifter," Clara said. "I thought I left and I assumed that was the end of it. I didn't write. He didn't write." 20 years went by. "And now?" Maggie asked. "He's apparently still in Dry Hollow," Clara said. "He came back a few years ago to help Chester." Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "Mama, the man carved your name into a tree. I am aware. He has apparently been waiting, or at least hoping, for 20 years. I don't know that. What else would that carving be for?" Clara picked up her fork again. "I am not sure I'm prepared for what might happen if I go and speak to him," she said. It was the most honest thing she had said in 4 days, possibly in 20 years. Maggie looked at her with an expression of exasperated affection. "Mama, you came all the way from Galveston. You could have sold this farm without ever setting foot on it, but you came." Clara did not have a response to that, because it was entirely true. She went to Dry Hollow the next morning. Maggie elected to stay at the farm, with the tact of someone who understood when they were a third wheel. Clara wore her blue dress, which was the best dress she had brought with her, and she told herself this was not significant. The Morton boarding house was a two-story affair on the east side of town, run by a widow named Agnes Morton, who rented out 3 rooms upstairs and served breakfast and supper. Clara introduced herself to Agnes Morton, who was friendly in the way of a woman who likes knowing who is in her town, and asked if Silas Mercer was available. Agnes Morton looked at her with the mild interest of a woman who had also been observing things for a very long time. "He's out back," she said. "Fixing the gate. Go around the side." Clara went around the side of the building. She came around the corner and she saw him. 20 years had changed him the way time changes good things, not diminishing them but deepening them. He was in his mid-40s now, 43 if her math was right, and he was lean still, though broader across the shoulders, and his hair was a dark brown with threads of gray at the temples. He was crouched over a gate hinge with a screwdriver, working with the same methodical attention she had always associated with him, and he had not heard her come around the corner. She stood still. He looked up. The moment stretched out like warm taffy, going thin and long and inevitable. Neither of them spoke. Clara was aware that she had planned to say something, something reasonable and measured, something like, "Hello, I'm back at the farm, I found the tree," but all of it had left her completely. She was 18 years old again in the very worst and best possible sense of the phrase. Silas Mercer set down the screwdriver slowly. He rose to his feet. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, which was the way you look at something you have spent a very long time thinking about and are genuinely surprised to find in front of you. "Clara," he said, and it was only her name, but she had been waiting 20 years to hear him say it. "I found the tree," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then something happened in his expression, something deep and unmistakable, a cracking open of something that had been held carefully in place for a very long time. "I wasn't sure you'd ever come back," he said. "I wasn't sure I would either," she said. "Chester left me the farm." "I know. Greer told me. I thought—" He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "I thought about writing to you when Chester told me he was leaving you the farm. I thought about writing to you 100 times over the years, actually." "Why didn't you?" "Same reason you didn't, I expect," he said. "I was afraid you'd made a life that didn't have room for what I was going to say." The heat pressed down on them. A horse made a sound in the stable 20 feet away. Somewhere in the town, someone was hammering, the sound carrying in the flat air. "I did make a life," Clara said. "I married a good man. He's gone now. I have a daughter who is 15 and who is the best thing I ever did." She looked at him steadily. "But there was always a part of the story I felt I'd left unfinished." "I know the feeling," he said. They stood there for a moment with 20 years between them, and the strange thing, the thing that would strike Clara later in the quiet of the evening, was that those 20 years did not feel like distance. They felt like depth, like the rings inside a tree. "I don't quite know where to begin," she admitted. "Neither do I," he said. And then, with the same quality of careful honesty that she had always associated with him, that quality of saying what was true without dressing it up, he said, "But I'm very glad you came." She had coffee with him at the boarding house table, with Agnes Morton making pointed efforts to be elsewhere and not entirely succeeding. They talked for 2 hours, and it was both entirely different from how it had been at 18 and entirely the same. Different because they were adults with weight behind them, with losses and years, and the particular gravitas of people who had lived through things. The same because the ease was still there, that specific, rare ease of talking to someone who was genuinely listening, who was genuinely present, who made the world get small and specific and close. She told him about Thomas, about his death, about the years of managing on her own in Galveston. She told him about Maggie, who was too clever for her own good and exactly the right amount of trouble. She told him about the life she had built, which was a real life and a good one, even with the part that had been missing. He told her about the years after she had left, the continuing drift, Kansas and Colorado and New Mexico, working cattle drives and at ranches, and wherever there was work to be had. He told her about a bad winter in Colorado in 1875, where he had nearly not come through it, and about a man he had worked for in New Mexico, who had been genuinely cruel, and whom he had left one day without a word, walking away from a situation that was not right for him, which he described without drama and without self-pity. He told her about coming back east, gradually over the years, the drift slowing as he got older. He told her about hearing from Chester Calloway. They had corresponded occasionally, Chester being the kind of man who kept track of people, and about making the decision to come back to Dry Hollow and see if the place still felt the way it had felt. "Did it?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. "The farm did," he said. "The town did. But I think what I was actually checking on was whether that feeling was still there." "What feeling?" she asked, though she knew. "That there was somewhere I was supposed to be," he said. "Somewhere that was mine." A pause. "I didn't know if I was going to be waiting 3 years or 30. I just knew I needed to leave something to say that I'd been there, that I hadn't forgotten." She thought about the letters carved into the oak bark. She thought about the patience that required not the patience of resignation but the patience of genuine faith. "Silas," she said, "I should tell you something. All right. I left because I was afraid," she said. "Not because I didn't, not because I wanted to leave." She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. "I have been telling myself for 20 years that I left because it was the practical thing, the sensible thing, and it was practical and sensible. My mother was ill. I needed to go. But I also stayed gone because I was afraid of what it would mean to come back, to want something that might not be there." He was quiet, listening, in the way he had always been quiet, actively, attentively. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," she said. "I'm 38 years old and I have already done the thing where I protect myself from loss by keeping things at arm's length, and it works, it does work, but it's—" She stopped, looking for the right word. "It's lonely," she said. "It's very lonely." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, carefully, the way you handle something that is both fragile and valuable. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not unless you send me." She turned her hand over and held his. It was the first time they had ever held hands, and it felt like something that had been a very long time overdue, and was now exactly right. She drove back to the farm that afternoon with a feeling that she recognized, after a moment's consideration, as hope. Not the fragile, terrified hope of an 18-year-old trying not to want too much, but something more seasoned, something with weight and structure, the kind of hope you can build on. Maggie was on the porch when she arrived. She looked at her mother's face and did not say anything for a moment, and then she said simply, "Well, we talked," Clara said, climbing down from the wagon. "He's coming to supper on Friday if that suits you." Maggie's expression was very composed. "Of course," she said. And then, after a beat, "How is he?" "He's very well," Clara said. A pause. "Do you like him?" Maggie asked. Clara led the horse toward the stable. "I do," she said. "Very much." She looked back at her daughter over her shoulder. "He's a good man, Maggie, you'll see." Friday's supper was. Clara decided. The most nerve-inducing meal she had cooked since her mother-in-law had come to Galveston in 1873. She made roast chicken and cornbread and stewed apples, which was a proper meal but not an extravagant one, because she did not want to be extravagant. She wanted to be herself, and herself was a woman who made good roast chicken and did not perform for anyone. Silas arrived at the appointed time, which she noted approvingly. He brought a small bundle of dried wildflowers from the roadside and presented them to Clara without ceremony or excessive explanation. And then he shook Maggie's hand when introduced, and said it was very good to meet her, and asked what she thought of Texas. Maggie, who had been preparing, Clara could tell, to be professionally skeptical, found herself slightly disarmed. "It's drier than Galveston," she said, "but there's more sky." "That's the best thing about it," Silas said. "The sky is extraordinary out here. On a clear night you feel like you could read by starlight." Maggie looked at him. "Have you tried?" "Once," he said. "I wouldn't recommend it. The print is still too small." Maggie smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine. Clara, who had been watching all of this from across the room while pretending to attend to the stove, exhaled silently. Supper was good. The conversation was the kind that builds. It started carefully and got easier, and by the end they were talking with the natural rhythm of people who had decided to genuinely engage with one another. Silas was good with Maggie, Clara observed. Not the false heartiness of a man trying to win over a child, but the genuine attentiveness of someone who found her interesting, which she was. Maggie, for her part, asked him 3 questions in the first half hour that were essentially tests of character. Clara recognized them for what they were, because they were exactly the kind of questions she would have asked, and he answered them all honestly, including the one about his drifting years, which he did not minimize or over-explain. After supper, Maggie went inside to write a letter to her friend in Galveston, ostensibly, possibly to give them privacy. Clara suspected the latter. She and Silas sat on the porch in the warm evening, and the crickets started up, and the sky over the fields went from orange to purple to deep blue, and it was not entirely unlike the evenings they had spent on this same porch 20 years ago. Except that they were older and the tree line was fuller, and they were not navigating possibility. They were navigating something more certain and more vulnerable and more real. "Maggie is extraordinary," Silas said. "She is," Clara agreed. "She is the best part of my life. How is she doing?" With all of this, the change, Clara considered. "Better than I feared," she said. "She is adaptable, and she was ready for a change, I think. Galveston felt finished to her in some way. She didn't have enough space there." "Texas is good for people who need space," Silas said. A silence, comfortable and warm. "Are you going to keep the farm?" he asked. "I think so," Clara said. "I wasn't certain when I came, but now, yes, I think I'm going to keep it." She looked out at the fields. "There's something about being here that feels right in a way that's hard to explain. Like something coming back into alignment." A pause. "Is that strange?" "No," he said. "I know that feeling very well." She looked at him. In the blue evening light, his face was softer, the lines in it readable as the marks of a life fully lived rather than evidence of hardship. She thought about the 17-year-old girl who had first looked at a young drifter and decided to dislike him, and about the 38-year-old woman she was now, sitting on a porch with that same drifter, both of them gray at the edges and exactly themselves in every way that mattered. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "All right. I am not 18 anymore. I'm not looking for something to feel temporary. I am not interested in being cautious this time." She met his eyes. "If this is going to be something, I need it to be something real. I need to know you're here." He turned to face her fully. His expression was very steady. "Clara, I carved your name into that tree." She felt the quiet force of that, its simplicity, its completeness. "That was 20 years ago," she pointed out. "And I'm still here," he said. "I came back to this place and I've been here for 3 years, and I would have waited another 20 if that's what it took." He paused. "I am not going anywhere." She held his gaze. Then she said, "All right." "All right," he repeated. The evening settled around them. The stars came out, one and then another and then all at once, the way they do in Texas, where the sky is very large and has a great deal of room. They began in the way of cautious people who have learned hard lessons and are willing to be careful precisely because what they are being careful with matters enormously. They spent time together in the gradual, genuine way of adults, meals and conversations and walks along the farm's perimeter in the early morning when the air was still cool. Silas helped Clara assess what the farm needed, which was his particular expertise, and she consulted him with the respect she gave to any competence while retaining her own authority over her property, which he understood and appreciated without needing it explained. The people of Dry Hollow watched with the interest that small towns always have in such developments. Agnes Morton was supportive in the unambiguous way of a woman who liked Silas Mercer and had always wondered why he had not found someone. Edna Hollies at the general store offered Clara one pointed look and one approving nod, which Clara took as the full endorsement it was intended to be. The men at the hardware store and the feed store, who knew Silas, treated Clara with the careful courtesy of people extending their regard for someone they respected. There were also people who were less entirely supportive. A man named Crawford, Daniel Crawford, who ran cattle north of town, had apparently had some design on the Callaway property and had been unhappy to learn it had been left to a family member rather than made available for purchase. He made his feelings known to Clara in a conversation outside the general store that was civil on the surface and entirely hostile underneath, suggesting that a widow woman from Galveston was unlikely to manage a working farm on her own in Texas, and that he would be happy to take it off her hands at a fair price. Clara looked at him with the expression she reserved for people who underestimated her, which was a particular blend of patience and absolute steel. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but I'm not selling." "You might find it harder than you expect," Crawford said. "Ranch country doesn't accommodate outside ideas real well." "I'm not from outside," Clara said pleasantly. "I'm Chester Calloway's family. This is my land." Crawford tipped his hat with the politeness of a man who would wait and see, and departed, and Clara stood in the street with a very calm face and a considerable awareness of what his particular brand of opposition might mean in practical terms. She told Silas about it that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his considerable qualities. "Crawford's been after Chester's land for years," he said. "Chester wouldn't sell. I'm not surprised he's circling." "What do I need to know about him?" Clara asked. "He's not a dangerous man in the direct sense," Silas said, choosing his words carefully. "But he has influence with some of the county men, and he's not above using it. He could make some things difficult, water rights, grazing access, that kind of thing." "Then I need to make sure those things are properly documented," Clara said. "I'll go back to Greer." "I'll come with you," Silas said. "I know what Chester had arranged and I can corroborate what I witnessed." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said simply. "I want to." She let him. They went to Greer together the following morning and spent 2 hours going through the farm's legal arrangements, after which Clara was satisfied that her interests were properly protected and that Crawford's options for interference were significantly limited. The young lawyer was thorough and methodical and impressed her. On the drive back from town, Silas said, "You handled that well." "I've been handling things on my own for a while," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not suggesting you needed handling done for you. I'm saying you handled it well." She glanced at him. "You're very careful with your words." "I've had a long time to think about which ones matter," he said. The summer deepened. August came with its particular insistence, the heat building daily toward an evening that never quite broke the tension, then releasing slightly in the early morning before beginning again. Clara made the farm her own in ways that were both practical and personal. She rearranged the kitchen. She planted a kitchen garden in the back that had been fallow. She put up curtains in the upstairs windows that were the blue-gray of the Galveston Sea, and that made Maggie smile when she saw them. Maggie was settling in her own way. She was a curious girl, and she explored the county's geography with the systematic appetite of someone who was making herself belong somewhere new. She made a friend, a girl named Ruth Halsey, whose father ran the feed store and who was similarly clever and similarly direct, and the two of them were frequently to be found on the Callaway Farm's porch arguing about books with the passionate energy of young women who had discovered they were not alone in caring deeply about ideas. Silas was good with both girls. He had the natural ease of someone who respected intelligence in whatever package it arrived, and he could hold his own in the book arguments, which gained him considerable standing with both Maggie and Ruth. He was also, Clara observed, the kind of man who knew when to be present and when to step back, when to offer help and when to let people manage for themselves. And this particular quality of perception, was the thing that she had remembered for 20 years and found now to be not just a memory but a living fact. One afternoon in late August, they were working in the north field, Clara clearing out an overgrown irrigation ditch, Silas repairing the fencing on the far side, and the sky in the west turned a particular color that Silas recognized and called out about. They had gotten the horses into the stable and themselves onto the porch before the storm arrived, a summer thunderstorm of the great, extravagant Texas variety, with lightning that turned the whole sky white and thunder that felt like something physical, something you could lean into. Maggie had gone to the Halsey house that afternoon and Clara was alone with Silas on the porch, watching the storm come across the fields in a wall of rain and dark air. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 5 minutes. The world smelled like wet earth and ozone and something like freedom. Clara was aware in that particular moment of exactly how close they were standing. Silas turned to look at her, and whatever was in her face was apparently clearly legible because something changed in his expression, a softening, a decision. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been trying very hard," he said, "to go at whatever pace you need. I want you to know that. I'm not rushing anything." "I know," she said. "But I also want you to know," he said carefully, "that I love you. I have loved you since the summer of 1869, and the only thing that has changed since then is that I love you considerably more now, because I know more of you." The rain came down. It came down hard and full, and the sound of it on the porch roof was like something jubilant. Clara looked at this man, this patient, careful, amber-eyed man who had carved her name into a tree and waited 20 years for the chance to say what he was saying, and felt the last piece of the old, careful architecture inside her simply come apart. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to be measured about it, but the truth is I've been in love with you since that summer, and it has never entirely gone away, and I'm very tired of pretending otherwise." He crossed the foot of space between them and took her face in his hands and kissed her in the rain loud dark of the porch. And it was the kind of kiss that is not just itself, but also 20 years of everything that came before it. Every conversation, every letter not written, every moment of wondering, every night of lying awake with the irreducible sense of something unfinished. It was a long time arriving, and it was absolutely worth it. When they broke apart, Clara was aware that she was smiling in a way she had not smiled in a very long time, possibly ever. Silas was looking at her with an expression of such uncomplicated, genuine happiness that it made her want to laugh. She laughed. He did too. The storm went on over them, and they stood together on the porch and laughed in the way of people who have come through something and are deeply, gratefully alive on the other side. The weeks that followed had a different quality. Not rushed, they were not rushing, because they had both waited long enough to know the value of taking things right, but warmer, clearer, more fully inhabited. Clara moved through her days with the specific energy of a person who has put something down that they had been carrying for a very long time. The farm work was still the farm work, demanding and physical and requiring constant attention, but it had a different character now, a partnership to it. Silas had moved from the boarding house to a room in town by that point, but he spent most of his time at the farm, working and talking and being present in the way that Clara was still, occasionally, genuinely surprised by, because he was so thoroughly and consistently himself, so reliably the person she had always understood him to be, that there was no adjustment period, no revelation of hidden character that changed the picture. He was simply, exactly, himself. Crawford made one more attempt, this one involving a water rights dispute that turned out to have no legal basis once Greer examined the documentation. The dispute resolved itself in a day and a half, and Crawford afterward seemed to accept that Clara Owens was not going to be dislodged and redirected his attentions elsewhere. Clara watched him pivot and felt a satisfaction that she did not bother to hide from Silas. "He thought you'd be easier than Chester," Silas said. "People often make that mistake," Clara said. "Not for long," he said. September came and the heat broke at last, and Texas moved into the softer season that was its version of autumn, still warm, but no longer merciless, the air having a quality of forgiving. The fields were harvested and turned over. The livestock were fat and settled. The farmhouse had become what Clara had slowly been making it, a real home, inhabited and purposeful, with her books on the shelves and her blue curtains at the windows and Maggie's drawings tacked to the kitchen wall. One evening, Silas arrived at the farm with a purposeful quality to him that Clara noticed. He came in, took off his hat, and sat down at the kitchen table in the way that indicated he had something to say. Maggie, demonstrating the social intelligence she always had when it mattered, said she was going to check on the chickens and disappeared. Clara sat across from Silas. "I've been thinking," he said. "I had gathered," she said. He looked at her. The amber eyes were steady and very direct. "I want to stay here," he said. "Properly. I want to stop being the man in the boarding house in town and be here, with you, if that's what you want." A pause. "What I'm asking, Clara, is if you'll marry me." She had been expecting it, somewhere at the back of her mind, and she had thought she knew what she would feel when it arrived. She had thought she would feel practical and careful, weighing things up with the measured consideration of a woman who had already done this once. She had not expected to feel what she actually felt, which was simple and overwhelming and absolutely clear. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, a breath she realized he had been holding. "Yes, yes," she said again. "Though I want you to know that I am a difficult woman, and I have strong opinions about most things, and I will not change for anyone, including you." "I know," he said. "That's one of the reasons I'm asking." She laughed. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held it. And outside the window the Texas evening was going gold and long, and everything felt, For once, exactly right. Maggie came back inside 7 minutes later, took one look at both their faces and said, "Well, finally," which made both of them laugh again. They were married on a Saturday in October at the white-painted church at the top of the hill. Clara wore her best dress, which was dark green with ivory buttons, and Silas wore a clean suit that Agnes Morton had helped him acquire. And they were married by the Reverend Hawthorne in a short ceremony with a small gathering. Maggie, Agnes Morton, Edna Hollies and her husband, the Halsey family including Ruth, Greer the lawyer and his wife, and a few of the neighboring farm families who had become acquaintances over the preceding months. It was not a grand wedding. Neither of them wanted grand. They wanted real. Maggie stood beside her mother and held her hand until the Reverend got to the ring portion, and then let go with a small squeeze that meant everything. When Silas said, "I do," he said it with the same directness he brought to everything, simply, clearly, without performance, and Clara felt it all the way through. When Reverend Hawthorne said they were married, Silas kissed her gently and held her face in his hands for a moment, looking at her. And she thought about the oak tree and the carved letters and the patience that had built this moment out of something that could have been nothing, out of an August evening and a parting and 20 years of holding something carefully. And she felt the full weight and the full grace of it. They walked out of the church into an October afternoon that was warm and golden and smelled of turning grass and clean air, and Maggie threw rice and Ruth threw more rice on Maggie's behalf. And Agnes Morton wept productively, and everyone was, in their various ways, genuinely happy. The celebration afterward was at the farm. Clara and Maggie had prepared food over the preceding 2 days, and there was apple cider and good bread and roast meat, and 3 different pies, and the afternoon stretched on long and easy and full of conversation. At some point, Silas and Clara slipped away from the gathering briefly and stood at the oak tree in the late afternoon light. She put her hand on the carved letters again, the way she had the very first day. He stood beside her. "I wasn't sure you'd see it," he said. "I wasn't sure the bark would hold it long enough." "How long ago did you carve it?" she asked. "About 6 months after I came back," he said. "About 2.5 years ago, Chester had mentioned he'd been meaning to leave you the farm, and he'd mentioned thinking about you. I thought if you ever came, I wanted you to know." He was quiet for a moment. "I know it's a strange thing to do. It's the most extraordinary thing anyone has ever done for me," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, her hand still on the tree, his shoulder warm and solid against her cheek. The farm spread out before them in the gold afternoon light, the fields and the stable and the white farmhouse with its blue-curtained windows. And behind them, the voices of their small wedding party drifted on the October air. It was an ordinary moment, and it was entirely extraordinary, the way the best moments always are. The winter came, and the farm went into its quieter season. Clara threw herself into the work of the quiet months, mending and planning and accounting, going through Chester's old records, and understanding what the farm needed going forward. Silas proved invaluable not just in the physical work, but in the knowledge he had accumulated of the property's specifics, its soil and its water and its particular rhythms. They worked together with an efficiency that impressed even themselves. Maggie continued her education. There was a school in Dry Hollow that was adequate, but Clara supplemented it rigorously, as she had always done, with books and conversation and the kind of rigorous thinking that required you to defend your premises. Maggie was sharp enough that she could hold her own in debates with both of them, which Clara considered an achievement, and Silas found genuinely enjoyable. In November, Maggie confided to her mother that she was thinking of becoming a teacher. She had been thinking about it for a while, she said, and being in Dry Hollow, watching the limited state of the school had made it more concrete. She was 15 and there was time, but she wanted Clara to know. Clara had told her that was a wonderful thing to want and that she would help her get there in whatever way she could. Silas said the same thing, Maggie added. Did you ask him? Clara asked. I wanted to know what he thought, Maggie said. She was quiet for a moment. I like talking to him, Mama. He thinks seriously. He doesn't tell me what I want to hear. No, Clara agreed. He doesn't. I'm glad you found him, Maggie said. She said it simply, as a fact without sentiment or drama, and it hit Clara directly in the center of her chest. So am I, Clara said. The winter passed. The spring came, and with it the kind of renewing energy that comes after a hard season successfully weathered. The farm was better for the care they had put into it over the winter. The fields were turned over and planted on schedule. New fencing went up along the eastern boundary. Clara hired 2 hands for the summer season, a young man named Pete and an older man named Frank who had worked neighboring farms before and who were solid workers and no trouble. And in April, Clara became aware that something had changed in herself, a specific, unmistakable awareness that she recognized from 15 years ago. She told Silas on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen, after Maggie had gone upstairs. She said it simply, the way she said most things, without preamble. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before on his face, something enormous and gentle and entirely undone, the expression of a man who has received news that he had not let himself hope for. Clara, he said. I know we haven't been married very long, she said. And I'm not. I know this is not uncomplicated at 38. Are you all right? He asked, and the question was entirely about her, entirely focused on her well-being, and that was so exactly right that she felt her eyes go warm. I'm healthy, she said. I'll see the doctor in town to be certain, but I feel well and I've done this before. She paused. I'm happy about it, she said. If you are. He stood up from his chair and came to her and held her, and she put her arms around him and rested her forehead against his shoulder, and he was quiet for a while in the way that was his particular form of speaking. I'm happy, he said. I'm very, very happy. Maggie, when told, was characteristically direct and characteristically wonderful. A baby, she said. I'm going to be a big sister. She sat with that for a moment. I'm going to be 16 when it's born. Another moment. That is extremely strange and also very good, Clara laughed. I'm glad you think so. Does it feel different from when you were expecting me? Maggie asked. I'll let you know, Clara said. Ask me in 6 months. The summer of 1890 was the fullest summer Clara had ever lived. The farm was working well, the partnership with Silas running smoothly, the relationship between the 4 of them, herself, Silas, Maggie, and the growing presence that was making itself known, having the quality of something that had found its shape. Clara worked the farm until she couldn't, then managed it from the house and the porch, delegating with the authority of someone who had always been better at directing than people initially assumed. She had the doctor in Dry Hollow look her over twice, a young physician named Dr. Prescott, who had come west 3 years ago and who was, to Clara's considerable relief, both competent and respectful. He told her she was in excellent health and that there was every reason to expect a straightforward outcome. There was also, in August, a letter from Galveston, from an old friend of Thomas's family, a man named Horace Finch, who had heard through the peculiar grapevine of small communities that Clara Owens had remarried and was expecting, and who wrote with a warmth that Clara appreciated and a curiosity that she expected. She wrote back a full account, the farm, Silas, Maggie's plans. The baby, because she had nothing to hide and no reason to be anything but clear about the life she was living. She thought, occasionally, about the people from her previous life who might have opinions about the choices she had made. She thought about it and then set it aside, because she was 39 years old and she had done the careful thing, the sensible thing, the protective thing for long enough. And she was now in the business of doing the true thing, which was living fully in the life she had. The baby came in October, a boy, arriving with the particular drama and also the particular rightness of new life, born in the farmhouse on a cool autumn evening while Silas held Clara's hand and Maggie sat downstairs with a composure that only occasionally cracked into anxious pacing. He was healthy and round-faced and had, from the very first hour, a quality of watchful attentiveness that his mother recognized immediately as familiar. "He looks at things the way you do," Clara told Silas when they were quiet in the aftermath. Silas, who was holding his son with the careful reverence of a man who was still absorbing the reality of what had happened, looked up at her. "How do I look at things?" "Like you're genuinely interested in understanding them," she said. He looked down at the baby again. The baby looked back at him with the solemn attention of someone taking notes. "What are we calling him?" Silas asked. They had discussed names. They had had the discussion in the way they discussed most things, not rushed, not performed, simply honest. "Chester," Clara said. "I want to call him Chester." Silas nodded slowly. "Chester," he repeated. He said it like he meant it. "Chester Mercer." Maggie came upstairs and stood in the doorway with an expression that was trying to be composed and not entirely succeeding. She looked at the baby for a long moment. "Hello," she said, very quietly, to her brother. Chester Mercer made a sound that was not precisely a response, but was in the right general direction. Maggie looked at Clara with a brilliance in her eyes that she was absolutely not going to call crying. "He's quite small," she said. "They are at first," Clara said. "He's perfect," Maggie said. And she said it with the completeness of someone making a formal declaration. And then she came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Chester Mercer for a long time with the concentrated devotion of a big sister, fully inhabiting the role. The years that followed moved forward with the particular rhythm of a good life. Not without difficulty, because life does not work that way, but with the quality of something built on a solid foundation, which holds when the wind comes. Maggie completed her schooling with the determination she brought to everything, and at 19 began teaching at the Dry Hollow School, which she proceeded to improve with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been making mental notes about its inadequacies for years. She was an excellent teacher, demanding and kind, and entirely unwilling to accept less than what her students were capable of. Dry Hollow, which had not always known what to make of her, came to regard her with a combination of slight wariness and deep respect that she seemed to find appropriate. The farm thrived. Silas's knowledge and Clara's organizational intelligence made it work better than it had in Chester's time. Not because Chester had been lacking, but because two people working well together are simply more capable than one. They expanded the kitchen garden, established a small apple orchard that they would not see fully productive for years, but that they planted with the long view, and improved the irrigation system with the advice of a man in the county who understood hydrology. Crawford, who had been a source of opposition in Clara's first months in Dry Hollow, gradually became something closer to neutral and eventually something closer to a grudging neighbor, which was sufficient. He was not a man she would ever particularly like, but he was no longer actively hostile, and in the pragmatic calculus of rural life, that was enough. Chester grew from infancy to toddlerhood with the watchful attentiveness that had been evident from his first hour. A boy who noticed everything and processed it at length before acting, which were his father's qualities layered over his mother's deep curiosity. He followed Silas around the farm with the focused dedication of a 6-year-old apprentice, learning the names of tools and the habits of animals and the particular language of growing things. And then, in the spring of 1895, when Chester was 4 years old and Maggie was 21 and teaching at the school, Clara told Silas one evening that they were going to need the second bedroom in the back of the house. He looked at her. His amber eyes were as warm as they had always been. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. He smiled, not the careful, restrained expression of a man managing his reactions, but a full, uncomplicated smile of genuine delight. He was 49 years old, and the gray at his temples had spread, and the lines in his face had deepened. And he was, Clara thought, more beautiful to her now than he had been at 23, because now she knew everything that made up those lines and that gray. "A girl this time, maybe," he said. "Maybe," she said. It was, in fact, a girl born in November of 1895, arriving with less drama than Chester, but with a set of opinions that made themselves known almost immediately. They called her Eleanor. It had been Silas's mother's name, and Clara had offered it first, unprompted, because she had seen his face when he talked about his mother, who had died when he was young, and she wanted him to have that. Silas Mercer was, from the beginning, a completely different creature from her brother. Loud where he was quiet, impulsive where he was considered, intensely social where he was self-contained. She and Chester developed the particular sibling dynamic of two people who are entirely different and entirely devoted to each other, which produced wonderful and occasionally chaotic results. Maggie adored Eleanor with the slightly helpless adoration of an aunt who can enjoy the chaos and then return to her own orderly life. Eleanor reciprocated completely, following Maggie around the school on the days when Clara brought her to visit with the utter confidence of someone who knows she is loved and is making the most of it. In the evenings, Clara and Silas sat on the porch the way they had always sat on the porch, in the warm dark with the crickets and the stars, or in the cold with the lamp inside and their breath clouding in the clear air, and talked with the ease of two people who had been doing this for years, and who had not run out of things to say and were not likely to. One evening in the fall of 1896, when Eleanor was almost a year old and Chester was 5 and doing his best to learn to read on his own schedule, Clara and Silas walked out to the oak tree at the edge of the farm the way they did sometimes, in the evenings when the light was long and gold and everything was quiet enough to hear the grass. The letters were still there. CO and SM loves you. Do not forget. The bark had grown slightly over the edges of the carving, the tree slowly absorbing it, but it was still legible, still clear. It would be legible for years yet, and after that it would be a scar in the wood, and after that it would be part of the tree entirely, indistinguishable from the rest of the living wood. Clara ran her fingers over the letters. She felt the same jolt she always felt, the specific, irreducible recognition of a past self and a present self and the long arc between them. "I used to come out here sometimes in the evenings," Silas said. "Before you came back, I'd come out here and look at this and feel." He paused. "It sounds foolish." "Tell me," she said. "Like it was a promise," he said. "Like I'd made a promise that the universe was holding for me." She looked at him. The evening light was in his eyes, amber and gold, and he was looking at the tree the way you look at something sacred, not with superstition but with the genuine recognition that some things carry more meaning than their physical form would suggest. "It kept it," she said. "It did," he said. She took his hand. He held it the way he had always held it, with care, with attention, with the specific quality of someone who knew what they had and was not taking it for granted. They stood at the tree for a while in the cooling evening, and then they turned back toward the house, where a lamp was burning in the kitchen window and Chester was at the table doing something incomprehensible to a wooden block, and Alina had presumably fallen asleep in her cradle, and Maggie was coming for supper, and the world was everything it was supposed to be. There is a kind of happiness that announces itself loudly and burns fast, and is over before it can be properly catalogued. And then there is the other kind, the kind that is quiet, that builds slowly, that is made of small moments accumulated over years. A hand held in the evening, a child's laugh in the yard, a fire in the stove on a cold morning, a conversation that starts over coffee and lasts past dark. The kind that is woven so thoroughly into the fabric of ordinary life that you can only see it fully when you stand back and look at the whole cloth. Clara Owens had spent 20 years with a piece of herself missing, and she had managed beautifully, because she was that kind of woman, the kind who manages. But managing is not the same as being whole, and she had known the difference, and she had made her peace with it the way you make peace with things you believe are simply how your life is going to be. She had not known that making peace with something does not mean it was supposed to be that way. The farm stood and grew and became what it was going to be. The oak tree at the edge of the property stood too, as it had stood for decades, as it would stand for decades more, holding in its bark the letters of two people who had found each other in the summer of 1869, lost each other, and found each other again, and who had spent the rest of their lives making sure there was nothing left uncarved. In the spring of 1900, Dry Hollow held its annual county fair. It was a larger affair that year than usual, because the town had grown considerably over the decade, and the fair had grown with it. There were livestock competitions and baking competitions and races for the children and music in the evening on the town square. Clara and Silas went together with Chester, who was 9 and deeply invested in the livestock competitions, and Alina, who was 4 and deeply invested in everything. Maggie joined them in the afternoon, arriving with Ruth Halsey, who was now Ruth Parker and expecting her first child, and who glowed with the specific radiance of that particular stage of life. It was a good day. It was, Clara thought, walking through the fair with Silas's hand in hers and Alina on his shoulders pointing at everything she could see and Chester somewhere ahead of them making authoritative pronouncements about the quality of the horses. It was the kind of day that you know, while it is happening, that you are going to remember. In the evening, when the music started in the square, Silas asked her to dance. He was not a natural dancer. This had been established early in their marriage to considerable mutual amusement. But he had been practicing, quietly and privately, in the way he approached most things, and he was better than he had been, and he held her correctly and moved with the general intention of staying in time with the music, and it was fine. It was more than fine. It was the best dancing she had ever done. Maggie danced with Ruth's husband and with 1 or 2 other people. Chester sat with Frank, their farm hand, and watched with the expression of someone making careful notes. Alina fell asleep against Silas's shoulder during a slow song, and he carried her home with the practiced ease of a man who had been carrying sleeping children for 5 years. Walking back to the farm in the dark, Chester on Maggie's heels asking questions about the fair animals, Alina asleep against Silas. Clara walked beside him with her hand in his arm, and the stars overhead in their great Texas abundance, and the night air warm and full of cricket sound. She thought, not for the first time, about the 18-year-old girl who had driven away from this county on a late summer morning with her heart packed away as carefully as her trunk. She thought about what that girl would have said if she had been told, "Here is what the next 20 years look like, and here is what comes after." She thought that girl would have wept, with relief probably, with gratitude, with the specific undoing of someone who has been very frightened for a very long time and is told that they don't have to be any more. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked quietly, with the awareness he always had of her. "About a girl leaving a farm 20 years ago," she said. And about how glad I am that she came back," she said. He looked at her. In the dark, his eyes were very steady and very warm. He tightened his arm around hers and they walked on. And Maggie called back from ahead, asking whether Chester was allowed to have a chicken at the farm on his own authority. And Chester said he absolutely was, and Clara said that was a discussion for tomorrow. And the night road back to the Callaway farm was familiar and long and entirely theirs. The oak tree was there when they arrived, as it always was, standing at the edge of the property in the dark. Clara could not see the letters from the road, but she knew they were there. CO and SM loves you. Do not forget, held in the living wood, growing slower with every year, becoming more itself, becoming permanent. She had not forgotten. She had never forgotten. She had just needed 20 years to understand that not forgetting and doing something about it were two different things, and that the second was in her power. Everything was, in the end, in her power. The coming back, the saying yes. The building of a life on land that had waited for her, with a man who had carved her name into a tree and had faith enough in both of them to let it stand. The house lights were on when they arrived. They had left a lamp burning, and the porch was warm and the night air was soft. And Clara Owens Mercer stood at the edge of her life with the full understanding of how she had gotten there and could not have said precisely which was sweeter, the arrival, or the knowing what the journey had cost and been worth. Silas carried Alina inside and up the stairs, moving with the quiet care of a man who did not want to wake what was sleeping. Clara followed with Chester, who was drooping but committed to walking under his own power until the very last moment. She got him to his room and his bed and his shoes off and his covers up, and he was asleep before she had finished the second blanket. She stood in the doorway and looked at her son, this watchful, careful, brown-haired boy who carried the best of both of them in some combination that was entirely his own, and she felt, for a moment, the full scale of what love was. Not the sharp, burning, early kind, though that had its own glory, but this kind, the accumulated, layered, ever-deepening kind, that includes your children and your history and your failures and your patience, and every morning you have woken up and chosen to keep building. She went back downstairs. Silas was in the kitchen, putting on water for tea, and she came up behind him and put her arms around him and rested her cheek against his back. He covered her hands with his, warm and solid, and they stood like that for a while in the quiet kitchen with the water heating and the lamp burning and the farm around them and the oak tree at the edge of the land holding its carved letters in the dark. "Silas," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad I found the tree," she said. He turned in her arms and looked at her. 20 years, and a marriage and 2 children and 1 life shared between them, and he still looked at her the way he had looked at her the very first morning she had brought him water at the fence line, like she was something genuinely surprising, something that warranted care and attention and time. "So am I," he said. "I am very, very glad." Outside, the Texas night was wide and dark and full of stars, and the oak tree stood at its post, patient and permanent, doing what trees do, holding what had been carved into it, holding it without complaint, holding it for as long as it took.